Our host location this week, Holyoke Catholic High School, is comprised in part of the former Assumption School, along with the new addition, which was added on to accommodate the high school in 2008. One of the features of this addition was a wonderful art studio space where students can explore their artistic talents. Recently, those talents were part of a mixed media exhibit at the Elms College Art Gallery. Combining the simplicity of haiku-like poetry with sculptures made from found materials, the students' inner lives came through in their works, as we now see in this video essay produced by Tim Lindop.
I am Ashley Marceau and I go to Holyoke Catholic High School. I remember growing up without a father. I remember how I was always singing and laughing. I remember my Pepe teaching me how to ride a bike. I remember my first communion. I remember losing my uncle to suicide. I remember my first Jonas Brothers concert. I remember my first 2 years of high school. I remember meeting my favorite band. I remember losing my Uncle Leo, my Meme, and my Pepe all in 10 months. I remember my first day of Holyoke Catholic. I remember my trip to Paris. I remember going to London and falling in love with it. I remember going to Abbey Road. I remember the amazing summer of 2012. I remember running after Justin Bieber's tour bus with my best friend. I remember the time I auditioned for Berklee College of Music. I remember how relieved I felt after it was over.
My name is Bridget OConnor and I attend Holyoke Catholic High School. I remember the storm as it came, the thunder in my head and the lightning in my eyes. I remember the pain I felt every day. I remember the tears that ran down my face. I remember the cold I felt on that painful day. I remember the fall that I took. I remember seeing my father cry. There was nothing I could do because I was dying inside. I remember the monsters that tortured me all the time. I remember the battles I could never win. I remember the sickness I felt every day. Nothing was pleasing, nothing was fun. It was all just a muted tone. I remember the confusion from the diagnosis. I remember the hurt in my mother's eyes. I was now unwelcome because I was different. I remember locking down, putting deadbolts and chains all around my heart. I remember the tears and the blood I shed. I remember the pain by looking at the scars. I remember no longer feeling a part of something. I remember my heart going cold from the loss of love.
I'm Mark Sweeney and I'm a student from Holyoke Catholic High School. I remember the warm summer days spent at my grandparents' house. I remember their old TV that had been around longer than me. I remember the sweet Jell-O that my grandmother left in the fridge. I remember the happy days. I remember the hot days. I remember the dark days. I remember the rainy days. I remember the board games played and forgotten. I remember the conversations and the stories told. I remember the summer sun and its warm rays casting shadows over me. I remember the days of my childhood that passed in that house. I remember the warm summer days spent at my grandparents' house.
My name is Sally Wang. I go to Holyoke Catholic High School. I remember watching the paint dry. I remember hearing the pounding of hammers. I remember a tower of falling tiles. I remember a miracle. I remember crying because my mother was crying. I remember the smell of garlic and the smell of rice. I remember 2 sweet and soft mountains of white. I remember burying myself in its warmth. I remember my mother getting angry and laughing in the end. I remember eating sweetbread for a month. I remember the feeling of a million white and brown jewels in my hands. I remember spilling them all over the floor. I remember the sound of my mother's tired and angry voice. I remember the grumbles of an annoyed employee. I remember my life in the restaurant. I remember my childhood. I remember being happy.